And the first briefing is from Eileen Canola, Climate Change Grant and Information Briefing. Eileen, please.
Thank you, Chair Larson, and thank you for having myself and Jesse Langdon, who is the GIS Principal Planner with PDS. This is an informational briefing, so it's not a briefing on one of the elements. However, it does inform the climate change and resiliency element that's being proposed as part of the 2024 update. So we were very happy to announce that the county was a recipient of a Commerce grant for approximately $99,000. And the intent of the grant was to help jurisdictions plan early for climate change and incorporate climate change in their comprehensive plan updates. So this grant was specifically either for a greenhouse gas inventory or a climate change vulnerability and risk assessment. So we chose the vulnerability risk assessment because we already had completed a greenhouse gas emission inventory. And Taylor, is it okay if I share my screen, or can you forward the slides for me?
Whatever easiest for you.
How about, can you forward them for me? That'd be awesome.
Are you able to see that okay?
I can see it. Thank you, Taylor. So next slide. Okay, maybe the next one. I already said, yeah, okay. So as many of you know, globally and locally, we've all been experiencing the impacts of climate change. The county and Puget Sound area has experienced more extreme heat events, and which have affected our roads, our public health, and our environment, and our infrastructure. We've experienced more wildfires and the risks for wildfire and sea level rise. And so it is one of the imperatives and one of a state goal and objective is to address climate change comprehensively. So Commerce was directed to do that and to develop a guidance document for jurisdictions to incorporate climate change into their comprehensive plans. Next slide, please. And just to provide a backdrop, so in 2021, PDS was beginning to scope the update to the 2024 comprehensive plan update. So our management, including David and Mike, thought it would be best to include a climate change element as part of our update. And one of the reasons for that was, of course, it was evident that we need to address climate change. But also during that time, there was a bill 1099 that was proposing to include climate change as a mandatory element for comprehensive plans, and that did not pass. And then in 2021, the state legislature appropriated funding for Commerce to develop the guidance for a climate change element and gave them funding to assist jurisdictions through grant opportunities as well. So in 2022, we applied for and received that Commerce grant to do a climate change vulnerability and risk assessment. That same year, House Bill 1099 came out, and that was the one that was going to require climate change as a mandatory element. That did not pass. And then from 2022 through this year, we worked very steadily on completing our grant deliverables. And then as well as this year, there was a similar bill to 1099, 1181, which did pass. And two of the major actions that happened through that was that the GMA was amended to include a new planning goal, which was a climate change and resiliency planning goal. And then the other thing was it does require a climate change and resiliency element as part of a comprehensive plan. However, per that bill, Snohomish County is not required to require that element until 2029. So that's during our 5-year update to the GMA. So next slide, please. So again, the purpose of the grant was for early climate change planning. So at the time, there was no requirement. It was an optional element, climate change and resiliency. And the grant was available to counties and cities who were going to prepare an update with the 2024 deadline. The amount was approximately $100,000, and the duration was from July 1st, 2022 to June 30th this year. And the amount we received was just shy of $100,000. Next slide, please. So this shows the grant deliverables. And it includes periodic fiscal and performance reporting to Commerce, which is ongoing. We do it monthly or so. And then we are required to do briefings to committees on the climate change grant. So we have an interdepartmental climate change and resiliency committee that we reported to periodically. And we had a minimum of 6 meetings, so we've done that. And we also are required to report to the Climate Action Advisory Committee, which we have done as well. And then we have a briefing to Planning Commission and Council. We brief Council as part of the grant contract. So that happened in June of 2022. And then we're briefing the Planning Commission tonight. We completed the climate change and vulnerability and risk assessment, which Jesse will show you in a little bit. And as part of that, we had 2 public outreach meetings, and we did have the information in Spanish and Korean. And a resolution of support for the grant deliverables was recently passed by the County Council, and a companion proclamation from the executive was passed in support of this grant and its deliverables. The 2 items that we're working on right now is a schedule of proposed actions to integrate the products developed by the grant activity into the comprehensive plan. So the products would be policies and programs that address the findings from the climate vulnerability and risk assessment. And then a draft ordinance that outlines those proposed actions. Next slide, please. So just to provide some context, Commerce was directed to develop a climate model element. Their guidance document a final draft will be issued at the end of June for review. And it basically directs jurisdictions to have 2 sub-elements. One is a greenhouse gas emission reduction sub-element or a mitigation one, and a resiliency sub-element. And a goal is to ensure that there are co-benefits in the policies that provide co-benefits like environmental benefits, public health, tribal coordination, and addresses equity as well. Next slide, please. So our new climate change and resiliency element is modeled after the guidance from Commerce. We do have those 2 sub-elements. And the focus of the greenhouse gas emissions is to ensure that we are reducing our greenhouse gas emissions to meet our regional target, and through sequestration and through just greenhouse gas reductions in general. And for the resiliency sub-element, through the vulnerability and risk assessment, we're understanding the areas of vulnerability to climate change, that being through our communities, our infrastructure, and our environment. And then we're providing that list, as was in the grant, to prioritize actions that the county can do. Next slide, please. So I'm going to pass it on to Jesse right now so he can go over the vulnerability and risk assessment. And this graphic just shows how this vulnerability risk assessment was comprised. It's essentially a lot of data layers primarily from Climate Impacts Group and a lot of state agencies. And just to ensure that we understand the vulnerabilities to our communities from the hazards of climate change and other natural hazards and their adaptive capacity. And if they have a low adaptive capacity, so that really helps us understand the risk to climate change. So Jesse, are you ready?
I am. Okay, thanks everybody. So I think what I'll do is actually go ahead and steal sharing, if that's okay. Okay. There we go. Okay, just give me 1 second. And also my cat is being really annoying. So if you hear meowing in the background, I apologize. Okay, can you guys see my screen? Yes?
We can. Yeah.
Okay, great. So yeah, so essentially the Climate Vulnerability Index is a tool that was developed by a contractor team, Burke and Parametrics. And essentially what it does is essentially it's an interactive map and then a series of tables in the background that kind of supply data to the map that can be manipulated. And so essentially this contractor team of Burke and Parametrics, they grouped various indicators from different spatial data sets into these 3 indexes, which Eileen had mentioned before. These 3 indexes are, and let me just turn that off. The 3 indexes are adaptive capacity, sensitivity, and exposure. And those comprise this combined vulnerability index. And so basically each of these sub-indices is composed of about 8 to 15 different indicators. And the indicators are derived from spatial data sets that are then mapped to census block groups from the US Census Bureau. We can kind of see just a kind of overview of what those census blocks look like. I'm going to turn off the city limits here. So you can see, just geographically over in the southwestern part of the state, because population's so much more dense there, the census group blocks are obviously much smaller, taking into account Edmonds and Mukilteo, Mount Lake Terrace, Everett. And then over on the eastern part of the state, we have these really large census group census blocks, because most of the eastern part of the state is made up of national forest and managed by the U.S. Forest Service. And so so basically each of the indicators is mapped to this series of indicators is mapped to each of the census block groups, and then each census block group then has a percentile rank that's calculated that compares it basically just to all the rest of the census block groups in the county. So it's all kind of relative to the universe of the county. And then all of these indicators are then managed in an Excel document, which I'll show you here in a minute. And so we can see here that the highest index value we have, vulnerability index value we have, for the county is 73 and the lowest is 16. And again, this is then an average of these 3 other types of indices, okay? And then, so this is kind of an interactive web map. This is what was delivered to us by the contractor. We are now hosting this on our internal servers. They did a really great job putting together the data and explaining the methodology. One of our big asks of them is that this isn't just kind of a one-off tool. So this isn't intended to just be a snapshot that's, we get it and it looks nice, but it gets out of date over time, and people forget about it. We want it to be kind of a living document. And so kind of behind the scenes of the web map is this table. And within this table are a whole series of sheets, or spreadsheets, tabs. And this is where we actually calculate all the different indices. And so we have our CVI index. This is kind of the consolidated vulnerability index. And then we have some of these other indices like the adaptive capacity, sensitivity index, exposure index, as well as kind of supporting data in here. And so just to give you, I think it's helpful to actually look at the data sources and kind of understand what these different indicators mean. So to start with the sensitivity indicators, so these are really things like age and health conditions of the population within the county that may affect how they'll, that's going to impact how they're affected by hazards, right? And so, we're thinking that, for instance, older folks, people with health problems, heart problems, respiratory diseases, mental health issues, physical health issues, those indicators are going to be related to how well are they going to adapt, or how sensitive they're going to be to all these various hazards and changes that we think are going to be coming. So that's the sensitivity indicators, the adaptive capacity up here. These are all the data sets that were part of that. Some of these sensitivity data sets, so you're seeing here, these are the indicators and these are the data sources. So without getting into too much into the weeds here, this stands for these ACS data. This is really where we get our census blocks from, essentially. And then we have health data from the CDC. Excuse me. And ACS stands for American Community Survey. So that's where we got a lot of our data sets. And then in our adaptive capacity, so these indicators are really intended to illustrate characteristics of people or places that it's basically meant to represent how are these populations going to be able to cope with climate change, right? So, if someone is living alone or doesn't have access to a vehicle, or the condition of their house is maybe not ideal, they may not be able to adapt as well to, changing climate. And then we also have some data sets like tree canopy coverage, impervious surface. That's really intended to be kind of a proxy for things like the heat island effect. And so ideally, if you have, an area that has more tree canopy than another area, then that might, mitigate things like heat island. And then finally, we have our exposure indicators, and this really represents just a range of impacts that are expected from climate change in the future. Most of this, as Eileen mentioned, comes from the UW Climate Impact Group, or SIG. And so this is kind of the meat and potatoes here, right? This is like extreme precipitation, what's the likelihood for wildfire, extreme heat events, sea level rise, flooding, urban heat island effect, which is projected to become more pronounced. Particulates in the atmosphere, this comes from the EPA. You can see we have sea level rise from NOAA and flooding from FEMA. So that's those are basically the indicators and then the data that goes into that. And the way that this tool is intended to work is if, we have all of this data kind of summarized. And so if we can do things like we can change basically how important do we think this indicator is. We have weighting criteria, probably kind of hard to see up here, but we have these columns up here where, we can change the weighting based on community feedback. We think, hey, likelihood of wildfire, we think that might be really important in, census block groups that are on the eastern part of the state, for instance, whereas we think, maybe flood impacts might be, we should change the weighting on that, in kind of riparian river corridors, and sea level rise that might impact some of the coastal areas. Maybe we should change the weighting on that. So it's meant to be kind of flexible in that sense. And then it's also intended to be flexible in terms of the data itself. And so, for instance, one of the things that we realized recently is that I think it's adaptive capacity. Probably not. I think it's, oh yeah, it is adaptive capacity. So you can see here we have this tree canopy, these tree canopy columns here. What we've realized is that the data that was used by the contractor is a slightly older data set, land cover data set representing tree canopy and impervious cover. And so we got a tip from our surface water management group that, hey, they had a new tree cover data set or new land cover data set that we can pull impervious surface and tree canopy data from, and so we can now kind of reprocess that data and just plug it in here. And so what we're hoping is that, you know, as we get more feedback from staff and from the community, we can either, you know, update this data. Maybe we can switch some of these data sources out if we find that, you know, this isn't really representative. For instance, you know, we have some flooding data that is basically FEMA's data. Oh, shoot, where is that? Under exposure. So we have here floodplain. So this is, you know, the number of impacted parcels per census block group that are, you know, right now, based on current existing data, could be impacted by 100-year, 500-year floods. And with some feedback from our surface water management group and some of the hydrologists have pointed out that they have a new data set that's probably more up to date than what FEMA has. It's more detailed. It also is looking at future projections, whereas this is really based on kind of historically where are the, you know, high probabilities for flooding events. And so we're thinking, you know, we're kind of looking into this and thinking, okay, is this data set something that's maybe better than what we included, and could we swap that out potentially? So just to go back quickly to the web tool. So this is what the public as well as staff will have direct access to. Probably not going to necessarily make this public, although we may. I think we're still talking about that as we kind of work on our communications rollout plan. But definitely the web application is going to be, and it's, you know, pretty straightforward if you have any kind of familiarity with using web maps. I'm sure everybody's familiar with Google Maps, but you know, some of you might be more familiar with GIS technology. But the idea here is we have different layers. In this case, we have layers representing the different indices. And so in this case, so that's our combined vulnerability index. We can let's click on one of these dark ones where it looks like we have a high vulnerability index score. And so I'm going to pick on Marysville just because that has a pretty dark color. And so what this does then is brings up a little pop-up associated with that census block. And we can see here that this has an index score of 73. So that's the highest score out of all of the census blocks, excuse me, within the county. We can see that the average for the county is 42. Okay. And so we can kind of, you know, then start to dig into this a little bit more and say, okay, well, why is this so high? Well, it has a really high adaptive capacity index, way higher than average, a high sensitivity index, and a higher than average exposure index. And then we can get into more of the details here. And these numbers represent kind of the percentile. So the percentile of all of the census block records within the county. And then here's the score, basically the vulnerability index score. And so we can see that, let's look for something that's kind of high for relative to the county. I think if we look here, so we can see floodplain in number of impacted parcels. So this has a really, this is a high percentile. This is a 97th percentile out of the county. It has a score of 95. So sea level rise and flood impacts are going to be really high here, according to our calculations. And so that's probably a big indicator or a big, you know, component as to why that value is so high. So, you know, and we can do that and in various places. We can come out here, you know, this is kind of an oddball because the census group is so large, but the reality is this is probably essentially Darrington and some of the unincorporated areas, you know, so essentially right in here, some of the unincorporated areas around Denton, around not Denton, what am I saying? Darrington, sorry. And so if we, look at this one, this also has, pretty high score, 64 compared to 42. I would imagine you can see here there's a high sensitivity index relative to the county. So we can kind of look at some of the factors there. I would think that there would be likelihood of wildfire would be pretty high. Oddly enough, that doesn't really come up super high, but floodplain impacts, that could be a really big one there. So anyhow, so this is one way to kind of look at some of the metrics that define the index. We also have kind of just some tools up here buttons up here allow us to see more detailed information about what goes into these indicators. And so, in here, for instance, we can look at mental health. Hold on, let's go back to this and we'll turn this off. So now we're just looking at mental health indicator, right? And so we can see, okay, we're seeing high mental health issues on the reservation, some high mental health issues. I can't remember off the top of my head what this city is right here. I should know. So we can, we can kind of dig into, looking at these indicators at a finer scale. Let's look at some of the exposure. So this is looking at wildfire likelihood. So this is actually like the underlying data that goes into the summaries for each of the census blocks. So that can be, so you can actually see like, okay, we're looking at wildfire data, but we can see it's modeled at a pretty coarse layer. So that's something to kind of take into account when we're looking at this. We look at some of the UW data, like from the SIG group, some of this weather related model data, like extreme precipitation, we can see this, this is pretty standard for regional climate models, is everything's modeled with these really big grid cells, right? And so we then have to kind of map that to these census blocks. So some of that can be kind of challenging, particularly, if you think about an area in here where you have a lot of, small scale census blocks, how do you kind of map these big modeled cells to that? So this kind of helps, provide some of that context. With sea level rise, we have here some of the model data, for instance. So this is some of the model data that was a direct input. And it got the urban heat island effect. So this is, pretty detailed information. Let's see. I've been kind of rambling here. Does anybody have any questions?
Questions for Jesse while we have him?
I do.
Commissioner Sheldon.
Yes. You're showing us a map that we can't have, correct?
That you can't have?
Yes, we can't log on to this and look.
At this point, it's not public, no, but it will be.
That's kind of teasing us, isn't it? Something we see and we can't have.
If I could jump in here, Commissioner Sheldon, the plan is to make this available to the public. We are targeting a public release in July, so very soon. It's part of a combination of things that the county executive would like to showcase related to climate change. And so there's a little bit of strategy here in the launch of this climate vulnerability index tool going out in the month of July. But the intent is to make it public for everyone to look at. Yes, this is a bit of a sneak peek, but you have to wait just maybe a couple of months to get in and play around with it yourself.
Sure. This is another question. I think Commissioner Campbell asked this one time. Will we be able to get a sheet of paper that with all the initials you use that we can have a copy of them?
The initials, do you mean like the acronyms?
Yes.
Yeah, we can do that for sure. You mean like some of this stuff, like some of the data sources,
Yes. And
like what ACS means?
Yeah, CBI and all that.
Sure. Yeah, we could definitely do that. That's a great idea. We can incorporate that into the, I think, into the communication rollout.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'm done.
Thank you. Commissioner Eck.
Yeah, Jesse, this is great. At some point in the process, will officials from the different municipalities be able to get kind of a closer view or a deeper kind of overview or something?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's going to be probably part of our communications plan, but we hadn't really. I mean, that's a good question. I don't think we've really lined up training that's specifically oriented to city staff or city managers, but it's probably something we could do.
Okay. Any other questions? Commissioner Sievers.
Could Snohomish County tomorrow be a good place to share this and do a little bit of training, just because you have representation from pretty much every municipality? I'm just thinking of forms that exist, because this seems like a very useful tool. There's a lot of information in this, but I think it's going to take some training for people to understand how to use it.
Yeah, Commissioner Sievers, I think it's a great suggestion. And that's certainly something that we can look and see on an upcoming, maybe take it through the various SCT committees coming up. We can coordinate with the new SCT manager, Ann Larson, regarding that, and see if we can kind of come up with a schedule. So I should just note, Eileen Canola is part of a group that is working on the communication strategy for it. So Eileen, I don't know if you want to jump in here and maybe talk a little bit about the rollout as we know it.
Sure. Yeah, so we're working with the Climate Action Advisory Committee, which is a community group, as well as our Interdepartmental Climate and Resiliency Committee, the ICRC, and other staff members to do a testing group to ensure that the functionality of the tool and to make sure we have directions. And we're hoping to embed it in a story map. And then to add some of those data layers that Jesse mentioned that are kind of site specific for like the Snohomish and the Snohomish watersheds. And so, yeah, we're taking all this into consideration into our rollout and aiming for July, as David mentioned. And I do believe that providing this to, when the rollout is released to the public, it'll be available to all cities and municipalities. However, I do think that SCT is a really good idea. And it may help other municipalities in the county prepare a climate change and resiliency element for their comprehensive plans.
Thank you, Eileen. Any other questions for Jesse or Eileen while we have them now? Commissioner Campbell?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on the climate action group too, so I get a piece of this. But in terms of Eileen, as you walked us through the minimum guidelines that Commerce is releasing, maybe end of June, 1st of July, you have the climate element, you have guidance from the Puget Sound Vision 2050 Regional Council. I really think this is great background information, and I think I'm really pleased that Snohomish County is pushing forward with a climate change element. Just curious, are we missing things? Are there things that, even though we don't have to do an update till 2029, are we really integrating kind of like the latest guidance, or are we just kind of have to redo things as we go?
That's a really good question. You're right. Some of the timing wasn't, advantageous to, to developing the element. We had to kind of forge ahead while things were still in development. We met with Commerce, and they mentioned that they were going to be doing a little bit of tweaks to their guidance document based on the passage of 1181. So they'll be doing that. I mean, in essence, we asked them, how do you measure good? If you look at our element, how do we know if that's good enough? So they just said that, a lot of the proof is going to be in the pudding in terms of, how well are we doing in tracking our greenhouse gas emissions, and how well are we doing in making those reductions? And then in terms of resiliency, we have, they had a lot of policies that we provided during our 30-day public comment period for the climate change element. We've included those, and we're trying to incorporate in our narrative for our climate change element the fact that the element doesn't stand on its own. It's really integrated, and a lot of the other land use, a lot of the other elements of the comprehensive plan, like the land use element, the parks and recreation element, the natural environment element, transportation element, they really help contribute to greenhouse gas emission reductions, like providing carbon sinks through parks, open space, wetlands, and estuaries. And then the transportation plan is really moving forward in multimodal infrastructure to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And then our transitions to EV with our county fleets. So there's a lot going on that's covered through all these different elements, and we're coming together and we're trying to reference those too. So when you mentioned, when you asked Tom, like, how do you integrate this? Because you're seeing element by element, but you're not seeing that weaving of this. And I think that's, that happens through all these different themes that each, even though there's topic specific like parks, but there's a lot of weaving going on between all of these elements, to come up with a countywide resiliency, greenhouse gas emissions, conservation of parks, the high quality of life in Snohomish County. So that's what we're trying to underscore, is that it takes a village, and we're all in this together, and we're all, with our partners in our with our special purpose districts, our school districts, Puget Sound Energy, PUD, water and wastewater providers, they're all doing their part, and they all have stamp mandates as well to make sure they reduce and try to transition out of fossil fuels.
Thanks, Eileen. Any other questions? If I may, watching your presentation, Jesse, you're mapping and scoring risk and vulnerability. That's quite a thing to do. It's an amazing thing to watch. I don't know if some of this is going to be controversial or not with some of the affected communities. So it'll be interesting to see this flesh out. But a question I have is, where you actually come up with high scores for risk and vulnerability, does that imply some future preemptive action? Because we're going to anticipate these big problems coming up. It's almost like an earthquake, only in slow motion with climate change. But a lot of those factors overlay when you look at natural disaster, earthquake, natural disaster, climate change. A lot of those factors appear to overlap. And I'm just wondering if we might see preemptive action of some sort.
Maybe I'll jump in here and answer that question. I think one of the things that the tool does do, as you indicated, is it tells us where there is the potential for problems, and it does allow the county and other entities to prioritize solutions, resources, money into those areas. And I think this is certainly one tool that's tied to climate change. You're going to see when you get the housing element, some information on housing affordability, and you're going to hear, you'll start to hear a little bit of where do we need to make investments? Where have we underinvested in areas? So this really is a tool that can be used to help prioritize where we should be looking to make investments as it's specific to climate change.
Okay, thank you. Eileen, did I see your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to David's remark that part of this, and some of the policies that you see in the climate change element, have to do with hazard mitigation planning. So a lot of these policies kind of dovetail and work in conjunction with hazard mitigation planning in terms of emergency response and planning for greater impacts from climate change. And that's one of the reasons why, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions is so very important, is because, we've increased our global temperature by 1 degree Celsius, and we understand that the projected impacts of an increase of 1.5, which we're trying to stave off, because that's like a tipping point. So we're trying to ensure that we're very earnest in our reduction of greenhouse gas to try to keep from that 1.5 degrees Celsius increase, because those are very significant and will be very impactful and severe.
Thank you. Any other questions? I wish we had saw the name of a local reporter in this group on this screen. This is the kind of information I'd love to see this going out to the public. It's significant. This is the end of this session. If we want to move on to the next one, any other questions or comments at this time? I think we've had a good round this time. Anything else on climate change? Okay, thanks, Eileen. Thanks, Jesse, very much. Next item up, item 2, new business, is conference plan update, natural environment element, and we have Terry Strandberg for this one. Terry, are you here?
I am here, thank you. Let me bring my presentation up here. Just find the right page here. There we go. Okay, is that presentation showing properly?